Singer, junkie, producer extraordinaire, multiple felon, and all-around super freak. Rick James is the stuff of legend today, but was one of the most colorful personalities of the 70s and 80s. Part musical luminary, part cautionary tale. This is the story of the one and only Rick James.
Strange.
Born James Ambrose Johnson Jr., Rick James was the most troublesome of his mother Mabel's 8 children. Rolling Stone reported that young James filled the family bathtub with stray dogs, dumped itching powder down his baby sister's back, and lodged a pearl in a brother's ear. By 13, he had a habit of stealing cars simply for the thrill of it, or sometimes because he wanted to see, quote, his women on the other side of town. In addition to juvenile grand theft auto, he spent his early teens doing heroin and committing burglary. Years later, doctors and courts found James to be sane, but there were certainly circumstances that influenced his early behavior. James grew up in poverty, and his abusive father abandoned the family when James was only 7. His mother, meanwhile, practiced religion but broke the law. According to James, Mabel was an ardent Catholic who also made most of her money facilitating illegal gambling for the Italian mob. James recalled, quote, crying and carrying numbers books in big shopping bags for his mother during the winter. Rick James dreaded the idea of getting drafted to fight in Vietnam, so around age 15 he lied his way into the Naval Reserve. Before long, James dodged the reserves too. He told Buffalo News that he couldn't take the, quote, regimentation and conformity. Instead, he spent much of his time drumming for jazz groups and doing drugs. In 1964, he was placed on active duty but fled to Toronto, Canada. In Toronto, James met Joni Mitchell and Neil Young and formed a band called the Mina Birds, which Young joined. The Mina Birds got signed to Motown Records, where James met Stevie Wonder and performed for him. Impressed, Wonder wanted to know his name. James gave the alias Ricky James Matthews, and Wonder suggested that he shorten it to Rick James. Still a fugitive, James ended up serving a year in military prison for desertion, which effectively ended the Mina Birds, but not the career of Rick James. As detailed in Glow, the autobiography of Rick James, during his early days in Motown, James worked as a staff writer, penning songs for the Miracles, Bobby Taylor and the Vancouvers, and the Spinners. However, James still thought himself underpaid. Enter singer Jimmy Ruffin, the brother of former Temptations lead vocalist David Ruffin. Jimmy proposed getting into the pimping business and using their respective girlfriends as employees. Someone with a normal moral compass would have rejected that suggestion outright, but James opted in and returned to Canada, where he and Ruffin embarked on their shady endeavor. According to James's self-serving account, he didn't have the heart to be good at the job, or rather, he had too much of a heart. He didn't force women to work when they were tired. He loaned them money and beat up violent Johns. Even so, despite quitting when his music career advanced, James never exactly renounced the attitudes that led him into the flesh trade, instead using his stint as a pimp to build his legend later on. After a couple of singles on A&M, Rick James headed back to Buffalo to sign with Motown subsidiary Gordy Records. It was here that he dropped his 1978 debut record, Come Get It, which went double platinum on the strength of singles like You and I. The label relationship was beneficial for both James and Motown, as the record label had seen sales drop precipitously as the 70s grew to a close. Over the next decades, James would release 10 records with Gordy. His creative streak hit its peak in 1981 with the release of Street Songs, a concept record with hit singles Give It To Me Baby, Fire and Desire, Ghetto Life, and of course, Super Freak. The record sold 3 million units in America alone and was noted for its seamless blending of diverse genres like rock, new wave, pop, and parliament-style funk. James himself referred to his eclectic style as punk funk. James had subsequent hits, but never repeated the runaway success of Street Songs. As the 80s wore on, the exaggerated sexuality and explicit references to drug use, both on his records and music videos and on stage, did their part to prevent James from becoming an A-list superstar like his protege rival Prince. As far as the public was concerned, James was an edgy party animal known for drug-fueled antics, much like those parodied on Chappelle's show years later. In addition to being a magnificent musician, James was an accomplished songwriter and producer. He wrote, produced, and performed on the Temptations' 1982 hit Standing at the Top. He also co-wrote, produced, and performed on Eddie Murphy's biggest hit, Party All the Time. James nearly collaborated with the legendary Diana Ross, too, but a phenomenal up-and-comer named Teena Marie caught his attention instead and captured his heart. As James recalled while walking around Motown's headquarters, I heard this girl singing her ass off. I walked in, I said, wow, you're really great. James would later say, never in my life had I heard such a range with so much passion. Even so, Marie didn't taste commercial success until she teamed up with James, who produced her first album. They would go on to sing a series of duets, including the immensely popular Fire and Desire. Marie and James became lovers, but the romance didn't last. They were just too different, Marie explained, citing James' ongoing outrageous personality and behavior. Even so, they remained close, and James bonded with Marie's daughter. In 2004, during his final musical performance before passing away that year, Rick James performed Fire and Desire with Teena. It's hard to believe that there was a time when Prince opened for Rick James, but that's exactly what happened in 1980. In one apocryphal incident, James grabbed Prince by the hair and poured cognac down his throat during an on-tour celebration of James' birthday. Laughing at the reaction from the famously light-drinking Prince, James was later dismayed when the younger artist stole the show night after night during the Fire It Up tour. James accused Prince of stealing much more than his thunder, though, saying, Prince was emulating my mic moves like a He was calling out my funk chants and even flashing my funk sign. James allegedly got revenge while opening for Prince. He supposedly stole Prince's synthesizers, used them on the 1981 album Street Songs, and then returned the synthesizers with a thank you note. As Rick James' chart positions sank lower and lower through the 80s, he helped maintain his profile with epic intoxication tales co-starring rock's biggest stars, including coke binges and rehab sessions with Aerosmith's Steven Tyler. Whether with famous company or in solo hotel room sessions, James' constant companion was cocaine, along with a varied pharmacopoeia of other uppers and downers. His reputation for drug use led to regular conflicts with law enforcement during tour stops, and James found himself without a label in 1990 due to poor sales and myriad legal battles. Fortunately for Rick James, MC Hammer's You Can't Touch This was one of the biggest songs of 1990, which featured a prominent sample from James's 1981 hit Super Freak. Turns out, Hammer used the sample to great effect, but without permission from James. Billboard lauded the strategy as a stroke of genius, noting that, quote, piggybacking on a well-known hit helped grab people's attention. Rick James saw it differently, saying, I wasn't impressed with that. He also wasn't impressed with the practice of sampling, at first. James's lawyers were quick to sue, and MC Hammer was forced to give James and his Super Freak co-writers an ongoing cut of the You Can't Touch This royalties. These earnings continue to pay out to the Rick James estate to this day. As James explained, You Can't Touch This made me a load of money, and did wonders for my appreciation of sampling. Nevertheless, he claimed he would have never allowed Hammer to sample Super Freak if the rapper had asked beforehand. Despite this major victory, the early 90s saw Rick James flush with cash, but with little public interest in his new music. By this time, James had been freebasing cocaine for several years, and one anecdote illustrates the depth of his addiction, hinting at major problems yet to come. The incident occurred shortly after an MC Hammer concert. James had recently ended his beef with Hammer, and rather than rip the rapper, joined him on stage to perform You Can't Touch This. As was his wont, James reached for his crack pipe after leaving the stage. As described by his drug supplier, Race Newman, things went awry when James set a plate ablaze in an attempt to burn smokable crack pipe residues. While walking with the flaming plate, he dropped it and his robe caught on fire. The flames raced up his robe, spreading to his sleeves. Newman extinguished them with a bedspread, and James, still smoldering, picked up the plate as if nothing had happened and took it into his room. After 11 studio albums, multiple awards, and seemingly endless songwriting and production credits, James' life and career hit the skids. James wrote that in 1991, after the death of his mother, "There was nothing to keep me from descending into the lowest level of hell." In 1991, James and his then-girlfriend, Tanya Hijazi, whom he later married, were arrested for tying up a female guest at their home, burning her roughly 20 times with a crack pipe and a heated butcher knife, and forcing her to take drugs and perform acts against her will. Then, while out on bail in 1992, James and Hijazi reportedly imprisoned music exec Mary Sauger, who had known James for 6 years. Sauger said the couple slapped and choked her repeatedly over the course of 20 hours. James and Hijazi stood trial for both crimes in 1993. In court, the singer described spiraling into a deep depression and trying to numb the heartache with narcotics. But he also insisted, quote, "I abuse drugs, not women." Hijazi pleaded guilty to assault and served 15 months. James was narrowly acquitted in the first case, but convicted of imprisoning and assaulting Mary Sagar, as well as selling drugs. He received a 5-year sentence. Rick James only spent a little over 2 years behind bars, during which he wrote more than 300 songs. He was then released early, not because of good behavior, but because of misconduct on the part of the investigator in his case, who bribed a witness with drugs and money to testify against James. James was released from prison in 1996 after paying Sagar more than $1 million in damages from a lost civil suit. Despite this, James released a somewhat successful comeback album, Urban Rhapsody, in 1997, and continued to make musical and acting appearances intermittently until his brief career revival following his appearance on Chappelle's show in early 2004.
Cocaine is a hell of a drug.
Rick James died on August 6, 2004. His body was discovered in his home by an assistant. He was 56. James had been working on a new album and a memoir at the time of his death. The memoir, The Confessions of Rick James, Memoirs of a Super Freak, was released in 2007. James passed away from pulmonary and cardiac failure, driven by a combination of heart disease, diabetes, stroke, and the effects of chronic drug abuse. His autopsy revealed 9 drugs in his system at the time of his death, including cocaine, methamphetamine, hydrocodone, various anti-anxiety drugs, and prescription meds for allergies and heart issues. Even so, James's death was not found to be due to the presence of any drug in particular, but from their influence on his health over many decades. If you or someone you know is struggling with addiction, please call the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Administration's 24/7 national helpline at 1-800-662-HELP. That's 1-800-662-4357.